Old farts. Never mind. Our story begins like many another horror story. It was a dark and stormy night when Susan and Barry got lost in the storm and ran out of gas in the middle of nowhere. Their GPS wasn't working, so they had no idea where they were. Worse yet, no cell coverage. Through the wind, lightning, and torrential rain, they could see an old gingerbread-style house from out of the 1800s. But when Barry suggested they make a run for it, Susan demurred. I don't like it. It looks like it could be haunted. Well, we can't stay here, Barry said. Besides, I see a light. Come on, any old port in the storm, you know. So they quickly ran through the pelting downpour to the shelter of the spacious porch. As Barry had noted, there were lights on inside, so he pressed the doorbell, which made an extremely rude and very personal noise. Susan hadn't realized that Barry had rung the bell, and looked at him, well, accusingly. "It wasn't me," he protested. "It was the doorbell." And as Susan didn't appear to believe him, he rang it again. Same rude noise. Thing must not be working, Barry muttered. The door was suddenly thrown open by a huge bearded man, dressed entirely in black, who said nothing, but simply stared at them with bulging eyes under shaggy brows, his wide nostrils flaring as if sucking in the night air. For several moments, Susan and Barry simply stared back at him. Then, quickly remembering his manners, Barry began to explain they were lost, were out of gas, could they borrow the phone, the usual stuff. The man-mountain just stood there, breathing deeply, when a querulous voice was heard emanating from inside the house. "Who is it, Pratt?" Another man, tall, cadaverous, head crowned with a halo of silvery hair, fluttered into the room, and he too stared at Susan and Barry with a look of consternation. Barry found himself once again explaining their predicament to the second man, who smiled thinly, his eyes cold, and when Barry had finished said, "It can't be helped. You must stay for dinner. And perhaps you're in luck, as the club is meeting tonight. Pratt prepared 2 more places." Their thin host, whose name apparently was Belcher, led Susan and Barry down a long, brightly lit and rather odoriferous hallway. In fact, it stunk to high heaven. "What's that terrible smell?" Susan whispered, to which Barry replied, "I don't know. Cigars, maybe." To which he added, "Cheap cigars." Before a pair of double doors, Belcher halted and turned to face them. "I must swear you both to total secrecy as to what you see and experience at table tonight. Our club and our peculiar pastimes are misunderstood by the cultural mainstream, and so our meetings are held in complete privacy." And with that, he threw open the doors. The young lovers were brought into a bright but exceedingly stuffy dining room, well lit by candles, a brilliant chandelier, and a roaring fire in an enormous fireplace, which helped explain why the room was so warm. Too warm. 10 men sat at the long rectangular table, 5 to each side. They were a mixed group, some tall, some small, some thin, some stout, all above the middle years, and dressed entirely in black. The room smelled even worse than the hallway, but there was no evidence of cigars, cheap or otherwise. Belcher explained Susan and Barry's presence to the 10 men, who looked none too pleased. Susan and Barry weren't happy either, but it seemed impossible to leave. The rain was still coming down in sheets, the rumble of the thunder becoming ever louder. The first course was placed in front of them, steaming lentil soup with a touch of sour cream. Both Barry and Susan ate sparingly, but the other diners dug in with gusto. Actually, they ate like pigs at the trough, with loud slurps, smacking lips and drooling, with several raising their bowls to their lips to drink from them as if they were drinking cups. When the soup was finished, Belcher asked the assembled diners to provide a rating, and one by one they stood up and farted. Susan and Barry just sat there in total shock. The farts varied in volume and length, some SBD, silent but deadly, some mere squeaks, others loud trumpet blasts, including one long trombone solo. Seeing their shocked expression, Belcher explained, "I would apologize, but it's hardly our fault that you stumbled upon our meeting. You came to us, remember? This is a dinner meeting of the Fartoff Society. The name, a play on words on my own name, Belcher, and on the names Fartoff and Belcher in that greatest dramatic work of all time, Waiting for Godot, by the revered Samuel Beckett." Susan and Barry had no idea what he was talking about. As men past middle age, we have dedicated ourselves to both the pleasures of the table and of flatulence, for when one is in their declining years, when one's vices become fewer and fewer, you must take your pleasures where you find them. Indeed, we have become connoisseurs of both the aroma and sounds of, shall I say, natural gas. This short speech was met with both thunderous applause and thunderous farting. At that point, a very fat man with a round, sweaty face, whose name was Gasser, levitated to his feet to ask what was on the evening's menu. The answer? Refried beans. Refried beans, followed by cabbage rolls and pierogies, washed down with beer and sparkling wine. This produced an explosion of both sound and smell, a stench so appalling that Susan and Barry were on the verge of losing consciousness. Who knows what might have happened, but at that precise moment the old house was struck by an enormous fire bolt of lightning, which caused all the methane that had built up inside to explode in a gigantic fireball. Susan and Barry stumbled from the ruins to find their car, and Pratt waiting for them. "I've taken the liberty," Pratt said, "of filling your car with, gas. I've also hung some air fresheners inside. I wouldn't tell anyone about this when you get back to town. They wouldn't believe you anyway." When Susan and Barry got home, they showered for a solid hour and burned all the clothes they were wearing, and they never told anyone about what had happened. They knew no one would believe it. But you believe it, right? 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 Dear listeners, I must apologize for this stinker, but I couldn't come up with a story idea, and I got tired of fooling around.